Okay, you're back with us at Goldseek.com radio. Today's special guest, Gerald Celente from the TrendsResearchInstitute. Well, my next guest says that democracy as we know it may very well have met its demise, that the moneyed elite now rule the global economy. Gerald Celente, director of the Trends Research Institute, his team produces the TrendsJournal with hard-hitting, in-depth analysis of the economic, social, political, and cultural trends. Welcome back, Gerald Celente.
Thanks for having me back, Chris.
You know, in your latest journal, you argue that democracy could come to an abrupt halt. Recently, the Fed chairman noted that the Fed can't get interest rates up very much because the economy would tank. There seems to be no exit plan in place from the Fed's $1 trillion annual buying spree of toxic securities. What does this mean, do you think, for the economy?
Well, it's very clear that the economy is going nowhere if they start tapering, as they call it, or if interest rates go up. The only thing that's kept the economy going that everybody knows is the so-called stimulus, which is really white shoe boy language for printing money out of thin air. Digital money not worth the paper it's not printed on. Despite the trillions of dollars that the Federal Reserve has printed and other central banks to boost the global economies, there's no recovery. It's a cover-up.
There's plenty of talk in the mainline media about green shoots, but unfortunately, the numbers just don't show that. We're watching, the housing market, at least as far as new housing starts are concerned, rolling over. This tends to be a leading indicator. Plus, unemployment stubbornly above even the Fed's target rate, been over 7.5, 7.6% for going on 6 consecutive years.
Well, let me just stop at that. It's really not. It's called a depression. This is what's happened before. You hear President Obama out on the campaign trail, for example. His new dog and pony show is that how he's going to revive the economy, and he keeps throwing out these numbers of how many jobs that have been created under his administration. What they don't talk about is that they're 2 million short already when you add in the people that have joined into the workforce since the Great Recession began. And the jobs that have been created, the other thing that he's not talking about is that they're mostly jobs that do not provide a living wage. The jobs that were lost during the Great Recession since it began, 3/5 of them were middle-income paying jobs. So again, there is no recovery. It's a cover-up. Look, once interest rates go up, the housing market goes down, this fake recovery stops. There is no exit strategy in ways of fixing the economy, Chris, just like there's never been an exit strategy to win the wars. There was no exit strategy for Vietnam, for Iraq, and for Afghanistan. Everything that the federal government does, from money to the military, and yet people keep voting them in and giving them their applause of confidence.
It's a chapter torn right from George Orwell's 1984. You talk about this perpetual warfare. Well, George Orwell wrote about this, and we're seeing so much of this activity in our country from now local municipalities flying drones all over this country, very heavily armored vehicles that are owned and operated by the DHS. Why don't you tell folks more?
Well, exactly. And by the way, this is going to be a big part of the next Trends Journal, too. And that, if you're forecasting trends, you'd be very concerned to know that martial law, a state of siege, is now going to become the routine for any time that there is a national crisis. For example, when you look what happened up in Boston back in April, they called a state of siege. They closed down over 100 square miles. Now, that was for one 19-year-old kid that they couldn't find. I mean, check it out, man. Look at America's number one enemies. This 19-year-old kid, that guy Bradley Manning. Now, there's another guy you got to watch out for, and it's Edward Snowden, They're kids. And this is what America is wasting its money on. But I want to make this point about that. They call the state of siege in Boston and close down 100 square miles, put businesses out of business for a day. Schools and universities closed down. People were prohibited from leaving their homes.
Without warrants.
Without warrants, and making them come out with their hands up? I mean, what is this? Don't people see what's going on? So why are they doing this? I think, Chris, I agree with you 100%. And again, when you go back to our top trends for 2013, the top one was war. And that's what we're looking at: class war, civil war, regional war, world war. And it's all adding up. And you pick a country: France, Italy, Spain, Portugal, Greece, Egypt, Romania, Russia, Bulgaria, Yemen, Sudan, Bahrain, Libya, Syria. You go down the list, up and down, India, China. Oh, you're talking about a slowdown? Now all the news is out there about the slowdown in China. And here's the deal. China consumes 40% of the natural resource metals. If China doesn't make stuff, the countries that are exporting natural resources to China, they're not exporting. If the Americans and the Europeans stop buying or slow down their buying, China's not making. There's real concern that China needs to have a GDP growth of at least 7% a year just to keep this Ponzi scheme afloat. And we were talking about the United States Central Bank pumping in all this cheap dough. China went overboard back in 2009 as well. You know, they dumped in trillions of yuan. So this whole thing is collapsing around the globe. There's no way of stopping the money printing. And when China said they said about the same time when Bernanke came out and talked about tapering, you look what happened to the global equity markets when all that happened, when China said that they weren't going to bail out their banks and Bernanke said that they were going to put tapering on the table. You saw the equity markets crashing. And then right away they all turned around and said, no, we're going to keep the money flow. And then it turned it around. So there's no way out, and that's why I'm still a believer in gold. And what happened to gold in the last couple of days is very important. You know, it's closing strongly above 1,300. And that's not all bad, because to me, and I've said this before on your show, our show, on Trends in the News that we have on every night, Monday through Friday, and on others, that when gold hit 1,200, around there, I said the downside risk at best is another $100 to $150. Now, you consider that. That's not a big downside risk, because the upside potential is far greater. The upside potential, I've said it, I stick by it, and I believe it, is 2,000 plus. I'm in gold for the golden years. This isn't an everyday trade. Things are not getting better. The geopolitical atmosphere is heating up, and the global economies are cooling down. To me, those are the reasons, some of them, to stay with gold.
I mean, I think investors really need to do their due diligence and ask themselves, do I really feel confident putting my hard-earned wealth and capital into a bond market, which has arguably been in a bull market for decades and looks a bit tired here, is starting to roll over. Interest rates really can't go much lower, but there sure is room on the upside. Of course, we know the bond market negatively correlated with rates. That, in the macro picture, does not seem to bode well for that market. We should see billions, if not trillions of dollars rolling out of bonds and into the commodities, and of course that can only benefit gold and silver. And then you can look at the equities market and ask a similar question. Well, we're in a bullish trend, but how much of that is behind us, and just how much reward is here given the risk? As you pointed out, the scary part of the selling is mostly behind us, and the risk to reward for precious metals certainly looking good.
You know, I bought my first buy of gold in 1978 at $187.50 an ounce. I also bought at the highest day in January. I think it was January 20th, 1980, and the intraday high was $875, and then it closed at $850, and then went down to crash for years after that. So I remember it well. It was a very different time. Back then, there was no China, Russia. It was the Soviet Union, and everything east of Berlin was locked behind the Iron Curtain. The point being is that the markets are very thinly traded. Gold and silver. Silver was controlled by the Hunt brothers in the United States. It's a very different world. There was no India that was trading and buying gold. And what's very different this time as well is back then, and again, I was there. I know. I lost a ton of money, and I was a young guy. It hit me hard. You know, I wasn't used to it. I didn't know what I was doing. I was like a young guy. I was just making all this money, and all of a sudden it collapsed. So I remember it very well. What's very different now than back then, and I challenge anyone to prove me wrong, is back then when the price of gold went down, people weren't rushing to buy for physical possession. That's very different, and that's what's going on now. The demand for physical possession, particularly among Asians, is so strong now, as you well know, that the premium on physical has gone way up. And there are also, every now and then we're hearing it, shortages. Number two, the other issue in this as well is that back then people overall weren't buying as much for possession. It was mostly the paper markets. So the paper markets and the hard asset markets are two very different things.
A look at the premiums you alluded to, and of course this is the difference between the price in London compared with Shanghai and Hong Kong. We've seen the typical premium hovering around $5 there. Recently, premiums as high as $30, spiking to north of $100. This is an exponential increase, and of course what that implies to many of our market watchers, there is insatiable demand, particularly for bullion, the smart money, if you will. They want to get their hands on as much bullion as possible as this paper shellacking comes to pass. But, you know, I'd also like to move back to unemployment for a moment. A couple of troubling statistics here domestically. Nearly half of U.S. is near or at the poverty level. This according to the U.S. Census Bureau's latest figures. This is not a pie-in-the-sky number pulled out of some blogosphere. This is, according to the Census Bureau, one of their latest numbers, half of the country, about 147 million people, are either at or near the poverty level, one paycheck away from moving into their cars.
Well, I mean, it's the future. It's been a takeover. The major multinationals have taken over. There is no opportunity. Here's the deal. Again, I'm old enough to remember. There used to be a thing called drugstores when I was a kid. You know, and every community had their own, and they had the local pharmacist owned it. Now what do you have? And they own all the other vertical elements of the business as well. And then you look at, there was no Macy's when I was a kid. There were two of them, one down in Herald Square, the other one up in Yonkers. Now they're everywhere. What did that do to all the clothing stores? And, of course, I'm only talking about Macy's, but just go around the country and listen to the names. You know, Nordstrom's, you go down the list. Target, one after. There was no Walmarts. You know, there were 5 and 10s. You know, you didn't buy big stuff. And then same thing. You keep going around. There was another thing, very quaint, arcane thought. They used to have family farms. Oh, yeah. And the big, there was no such thing as agribusiness, and one guy didn't control it, or one big company. And now you have a handful. I mean, you have one company that owns just about all the seeds now. And then you keep going down the list, Chris. Go down to, I'm up here in Colonial Kingston, New York, an hour and a half north of New York City. Right down the street was O'Reilly's stationery store. O'Reilly, who? There's Staples, and there's Office Depot. We don't need any entrepreneurs to be in business, not when the big hedge funds and private equity groups could control all the business. And then you get out of college owning $40, $50, $60, $70, $100,000 worth of debt that you're becoming an indentured servant to, and what could you do with it? I got an idea. You could get a job at ShopRite. You could get a job at Staples, at Walmart's, at Home Goods. You could get a job stocking shelves, or you could work at the cashier. And if you're really good, you'll get maybe an advancement someday, and you can become, even if you're really great, a store manager. Hey, how about this one? Hardware stores. Isn't that a quaint thought? And what the other people, and the people don't realize, is that the more the consolidation, not only does it put the small entrepreneur out, now your product line really diminishes. When you had all those stationary stores, you had a lot more selection. And the same thing with hardware and down the line. Now your selections are also limited only to the big companies that are big enough to stock the big guys.
Another topic you touch on in the latest journal, and you alluded to this just a moment ago, debt. For instance, about half of U.S. households are carrying credit card balances month to month, but few realize that just an average balance over many years can rack up, now hold on to your hats for this one, millions of dollars by retirement age. Half of households spend more than they earn and leave this world than less than they had at birth.
Well, it's the decline of the United States for all the reasons that we're talking about. It's criminal. It's a criminal activity to me to get some young kid, 17, 18, 19 years old. They want to go to college, and they had their parents sign off on the debt. How about that? That we mentioned it, but to add on to what you're saying is that now college debt is over $1 trillion. It's more than credit card debt. And the parents are signing off of this, and the kids can't pay. Now the parents are being forced to pay. If they can't pay, they lose what they have, including their homes. And if the parents, they hoodwink their grandparents into doing it, and now they're on the hook. This is a criminal operation. It's the money changes. It's absolutely no different than when Jesus Christ was around driving the money changes out of the temple. And it's no different than years later, thousands of years later, when James Madison also warned us in the same language about the money changes. The money changes have taken over. And it's about time somebody drives them out of the temple. But the temple now it's Frankfurt, it's the city of London, it's Wall Street in Washington. Those are the temples. It's a takeover.
Boston University economist Lawrence Kotlikoff has calculated that the U.S. government is facing unfunded liabilities of $222 trillion. But, of course, I'm sure he's including Medicaid, Medicare, Social Security. I'd like your thoughts as to whether or not this is going to be tenable and just how you think the government will try to work its way out of this mess. Will they just fire up the printing press?
All you have to do is look at Detroit. Detroit is a metaphor for what's going on in the United States in a number of ways. Number one, it's gone from Motown to no town, and it's not the fault of just exporting our jobs overseas. It's also the fault of GM, Chrysler, and Ford, and the major manufacturers. And I've dealt with these companies before as a trend forecaster. You couldn't tell them anything. They knew nothing and had an attitude that the sun rose and set in their little minds. So they got what they deserved. And this cars, to me, they're still not the right vehicles. They look like something out of a video game that has nothing to do with the operation of a car and makes it more expensive to fix. Having said that, the other way the cities have been destroyed in the country is with all of this urban renewal. They cut up Detroit, New Haven, you name the country, all into little tiny pieces by running roads through them. So they kill the core of the country. They export the jobs, and America's been behind the scene so many different ways in innovation, in turning it into, rather than survival, and that's all they ever think about. So to go back to your question, how do you get out of this? And again, using Detroit as the example, they can't pay their pensions. So, by the way, and benefits to their employees, the banks are getting 75 cents on the dollar. That shows you how rigged the game is. Now, how's the United States going to get out of this and all the other cities, communities, and states that are also over-leveraged in pensions and benefits? They're not. Are they going to yank up the printing presses? That's your other question. I don't believe so. I think they'll devalue the dollar, and that's the way they'll get around it. One way or another, it's going to be whether they print more money or call for an official devaluation. It's the same thing. The result is that what you own in terms of currency is going to be worth a lot less than what you thought it was as they continue to devalue it, which again goes back to That's why I like gold. I am not a gold buyer because of my fear of hyperinflation. I buy gold because of the obvious devaluation that's in front of our eyes every day, with $85 billion a month of buying mortgage-backed securities and bonds and all of the stimulus that's gone into the economy via low interest rates and allowing banks to borrow for essentially nothing to keep the economy going, and that's what's boosting the stock market and mostly corporate profits.
You also say the United States Constitution is under assault, that this trend is emerging, though, all over the globe, and that economic malaise is leading to widespread poverty, increased violence, and we're certainly seeing that accelerate. Nearly 50 million Americans now require food stamps to put food on the dinner table. Over 1 million American school kids are homeless, living with their parents either in cars or in tent villages. I'd like your thoughts on the assault on the American Constitution.
Well, again, it's been assaulted in so many different ways. But let's talk about Trayvon Martin, or what else could we do? Oh, how about the princes, the new prince? You know, they named him George. I thought they named him Trayvon, you know. I mean, the major media broke away from all their regular programming to watch the prince and the duchess come out of the hospital holding their kid and all goo-gooing and gagaing over the spectacle. So why should we talk about anything important? You know, I mean, that's really, I mean, the whole thing is collapsing in front of us, and people don't want to recognize that it cannot be fixed. You're talking about a robbing of rights. Snowden now is out of the news. You just had a couple of days ago where the House tried to put amendments on that would restrict the National Security Agency from watching everything that we do, covering our every move that we make. It was defeated under intense pressure by the Obama administration. You're looking at, as I mentioned earlier, martial law declared in Boston following the Boston bombing. You just saw night maneuvers in Chicago with Black Hawk helicopters flying over the loop. You're looking now at the military waging urban maneuvers in major cities. And now also, even worse than that, and as part of it, they have just killed the Bill of Rights. They shredded it. And very interestingly, Chris, this issue about the military taking over civil duties, that was one of the reasons for the revolution. And people seem not to know that. And why should they know it? But that's what really happened. That was one of the things that they railed out against King George because, quote, he had affected to render the military independent of and superior to civil power. Well, that has now been abolished by the White House and the military. And you were talking before about, you know, all of these localities now having SWAT teams and having these armored vehicles and the militarization of the police force. So that's where it's going. It's in front of us. I'm not making any of this up. Matter of fact, even the Wall Street Journal did a major story on the rise of the warrior cop.
I guess it's a cliche now, but we've heard the expression, when people fear their government, there is tyranny, but when government fears the people, there's freedom. So here's a question. What do you fear more, terrorists or your government?
That's it, of course, you know. And again, you know, is John Adams wrong? Is liberty once lost, lost forever? Or can it be restored? It's up to the individual. When enough people stand up and speak out and say no, then it's going to change.
People are terrified. My theory, it's just a pet theory, maybe a working thesis, if you will. When inflation has robbed people of their disposable income to such an enormous level to where half the country is living from paycheck to paycheck, if not worse than that, because you could say the other half are virtually dependent on the government for sustenance. When you reach that critical mass, I'm convinced that folks are simply terrified of making any waves for fear of capsizing their boat.
You may be 100% correct, but what boat do they live? They're in a sinking boat anyway. And look what just happened in Bulgaria. This is something that, of course, how about I wonder how the Duchess is doing, I mean, come on, nobody's talking about Bulgaria. They don't even know they don't even know what Bulgaria is in this country. But the people have been out in the street protesting for 40 days. They had to call in the police because they barricaded the parliament and wouldn't let the ministers and MPs out. They're demanding justice.
Because in order to protest for 40 days, you've got to have some stockpile. You've got to have a family farm or something to fall back on to provide you with sustenance for 4 days, let alone 40 days here, because we're all working ourselves to the bone just to try to pay all the bills that are pouring in.
And look at the people, my God. I mean, it's like they have to eat every 5 seconds. I mean, look at this country's, it's the most obese nation in the world. You walk around, you say, Mike, what happened? Look at the young people. I mean, when I was in school, there were a couple of heavy kids, but it was mostly genetic, and they were big kids, It's emblematic of, I think, two big problems we're facing. Firstly, overly calorically filled foods and nutritionally deplete. And when you add those two things together, you have people eating essentially high-calorie foods which do nothing to satisfy your appetite, and then throw in there all of these excitotoxins, which say to the brain, i.e. like MSG and so many others, aspartame, which turns into formaldehyde, embalming fluid in your brain. Okay, I mean, you add all these factors in, and you just have half the country in dire straits. Are there any other topics you'd like to close this dialogue with today? Well, on the one you're on, and that's the future, and it's a big trend, whole health healing, and that's where the money is. Clean food. I coined that term, by the way, in 1993, and you may not know this. I have an honorary doctorate degree in complementary medicine for the work that I've done over the years in the field from the National University of Health Sciences. So I agree with 100% with what you just said about food, and that's the future. If you want an entrepreneurial business that's going to make money, make you feel good, and make people better, healthier, and more spiritually attuned to what's going on, because that's what it's going to take to make the change happen, that's the business for you. And I also want to let you know that we're redesigning the TrendsJournal. It's going to be a whole new look, all new features, and it's going to show you history before it happens like nothing else on the planet, and it'll be out in a couple of weeks, so I urge everyone to subscribe, and of course there's a money-back guarantee.
Excellent. Well, Dr. Celente, we want to thank you today for all of your insightful thoughts and comments. We want to wish you continued success.
Thanks for having me.